In January 2017, authorities solemnly called an end to the global effort which had occupied the minds and the prayers of millions for the past 3 years. Over 120,000 square kilometres of Indian Ocean had been combed around the clock with cutting-edge technology, but despite all this effort, we're still no closer to solving the disappearance of Flight MH370. Flying is one of the most commonly held fears. The idea of soaring high above the clouds, travelling at more than 500 miles per hour, is understandably a terrifying thought for many of us. It's easy to believe that aircraft malfunctions occur all too often, especially with TV programmes such as Air Crash Investigation and Seconds from Disaster reinforcing this assumption. However, despite the seemingly hardwired reluctance to fly, it is in fact the safest way to travel. But when the unthinkable does happen, the results are invariably tragic. The margin of error is so narrow, the balance between success and failure so precarious, that even a minuscule error could spell disaster. Still, the likelihood of anything untoward occurring on your flight is almost non-existent. It's something that only happens in movies or to other people you've never met. It couldn't possibly happen to you. This is likely what the 227 passengers aboard Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 were telling themselves, as we all do to settle our pre-flight nerves, whilst they taxied along the runway at Kuala Lumpur awaiting takeoff. After all, they had very little to be concerned about. The flight path, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, to Beijing, China, is a well-travelled route, with 2 regular flights every day. The aircraft, a Boeing 777 commercial airliner, was one of thousands of identical planes which make daily flights all over the globe, and their crew of 12 was led by Captain Zahari Ahmad Saar, an extremely competent and experienced pilot with more than 30 years in the air. This knowledge likely comforted those on board through takeoff, and for the next half an hour or so, nobody could have suspected that they would become part of one of the most mystifying disappearances of our time. Very little is known with much certainty exactly what happened. In their absence, facts and data soon gave way to conspiracy and speculation. The story quickly became a global headliner, and those intending to turn a profit, unfortunately, did little more than muddy the already murky waters of the flight's disappearance. But now, those waters have, if not cleared, at least settled. The investigation has drawn to a close, and with the event no longer in the public eye, it is only now that we have a somewhat clearer view. Now we can better ask, what really happened to this plane and all those aboard? Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 left Kuala Lumpur International Airport on schedule at 12:42 am on March 8, 2014. The flight was bound for Beijing Capital International Airport, and was by all accounts on course for the next 38 minutes. At this point, Captain Saar signed off as they switched over from Malaysian to Vietnamese air traffic control, with the now infamous farewell, "Good night Malaysia MH370. The plane would never be seen or heard from again, as the transponder was curiously turned off shortly thereafter and was not picked up by Vietnamese radar. Multiple attempts were made to contact the crew of MH370 via satellite phone, which should have worked in the event that onboard communications had malfunctioned, but these all went unanswered. This behaviour was considered a sign that there had been a terror attack, either a hijacking or sabotage of the aircraft, but this was quickly ruled out as not one single terror group claimed responsibility, which would usually have been the case. It increasingly became apparent that MH370 was lost, likely having crashed into the ocean based on its last confirmed position and flight path. Search attempts were launched almost immediately, but with little idea of where to begin, and given the vast area in which the aircraft could feasibly be, teams from Vietnam, Malaysia and Singapore fruitlessly searched the immense stretch of water between Vietnam and China. In the days and weeks that followed, 40 ships worked around the clock, as well as 34 aircraft which flew during daylight hours, scouring an ever-widening expanse of ocean, hoping to catch something, a shadow under the waves, a piece of debris floating on the surface, but it was all to no avail. 26 countries joined the search for MH370, but despite this concerted global effort, no real progress was made. Understandably, there was a huge outcry from the devastated families of those on board, criticising officials for their inability to turn up any evidence, prolonging their mourning with no answers as to the fates of their loved ones. This is not a job that anyone would envy. The odds were completely stacked against the search operation from the very beginning. However, that is not to say that all criticism of the effort was undue. Crucially, the initial search had taken place in completely the wrong location. On the fourth day of the operation, the Malaysian Prime Minister admitted in a press conference that the flight had turned back on itself and flown back over the Malaysian mainland. As with any case, the first 48 hours are the most important. Clues diminish quickly during this time, so those first 4 days could well have been critical, and their loss may have played a significant role in the aircraft remaining undiscovered. Since then, evidence has been near impossible to come by. But what do we know? Firstly, it can be determined based on satellite data and information from engineers at Inmarsat that MH370 did indeed go missing during the exchange between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. It then took a sharp turn shortly after clearing the Malaysian mainland, doubling back on itself and flying back over the peninsula before turning once again and flying straight towards the Indian Ocean. There are several things to note about this portion of MH370's flight. For example, the plane's wing dipped for an unusually prolonged period whilst flying over Captain Sar's hometown of Penang, leading many to speculate that it was a poetic farewell to the pilot's childhood home. Secondly, and just as bizarrely, the aircraft flew back almost exactly along the Malaysian-Thai border. Some experts have determined this to have been a calculated move, taken to avoid detection by either country's radar. These actions are the foundation of one of the more prevalent theories regarding the flight's disappearance. By this point, it is suspected that the crew on board would have known that something was wrong, which raises one of the key questions surrounding the disappearance. Why does it seem that nobody on board tried to stop whoever was diverting them? It has been assumed by aviation experts that the plane was depressurized, depriving the cabin of oxygen and in turn disabling the passengers and crew. Perhaps there is some comfort in this idea, that all those on board died painlessly in their sleep, long before the aircraft likely plummeted into the ocean. With the help of Inmarsat, we can determine that the aircraft continued out into the Indian Ocean, but with all communications equipment disabled, it is impossible to determine exactly where. However, a new search area could be drawn up based on fuel reserves and airspeed. Using these calculations, the net was narrowed to a vast area of the southern Indian Ocean, a region mapped in even less detail than the surface of the Moon, with tropical storms and some of the most tumultuous seas on the planet. The first piece of wreckage from MH370 took more than a year to surface. It was a fragment of the plane's wing, which washed ashore thousands of miles from Kuala Lumpur, on Reunion Island, a tiny landmass off the coast of Madagascar. The specific wing part that was found, the flaperon, casts potentially huge implications on the flight's final moments, according to experts who have tried to fill in the blanks. However, this is the best anyone can unfortunately manage. Educated guesses and theories that may sound convincing, but ultimately will likely go unconfirmed. This pessimism seems to be shared by the relevant authorities, who in January 2017 called off the search having found nothing but fragments of the aircraft. The conclusion reached by the Malaysian government and the Australian Transport Safety Bureau was that an oxygen deficiency had incapacitated all on board, passengers and crew alike. The plane, then flying on autopilot, continued out into the Indian Ocean before eventually running out of fuel and sinking beneath the surface. This explanation was unconvincing for many people, as it does not seem to answer some key questions. Why was the transponder switched off? How would autopilot fly such a specific route along the border? Would the emergency air supply not have deployed? What purpose would the autopilot serve in dipping the aircraft's wing whilst flying straight? With a sense that this conclusion was incomplete or misleading, the tone of discussion surrounding the mystery soon turned to whispers of conspiracy, which as per usual run from the plausible to the downright absurd. Before we share with you some of the more prevalent theories regarding the disappearance, we think it is important to remember that this was a tragedy, with well over 200 families still without knowledge of what happened to their loved ones. And before condemning anybody, we must recognise that none of these theories have been confirmed as true, and judgment should be reserved. So with that in mind, what other explanations are there? Conspiracy theorists have suggested that the flight was detected by radar on approach to the US military base on the atoll of Diego Garcia, and that the aircraft was either instructed to land or shot down by surface-to-air missile defences after the jetliner failed to respond to warnings. Much of this claim is based on the geography of the area where MH370 was last recorded, combined with the flight's route, fuel reserves and available landing areas, all of which were consistent with a flight path towards the island. Notably, these allegations have all been refuted by the FBI, which reported that having analysed the event, the claim was completely unfounded, that there was nothing suspicious whatsoever concerning the flight's relationship with a military base. Some other theories claim that the plane was taken over remotely in order to foil a hijacking, an idea echoed by the Malaysian Prime Minister in 2018, although he did not give any indication as to who he thought was responsible. Other more insidious theories circulate, claiming that MH370 was shot down by the usual suspects in the Western world's political blame game, the Russians, Chinese or North Koreans. This argument would have little credence if it wasn't for the fact that another Malaysian Airlines flight, MH17, was allegedly, though never proven to be, shot down by Russian anti-air missiles, leading many to believe the same could be the case for MH370. Critically, however, MH17 was shot down in Ukrainian airspace, whereas MH370 disappeared far from any zones of conflict. Another interesting conspiracy theory was put forth by aviation expert Jeff Wise, and revolves around the fact that 20 employees from Freescale Semiconductor, an avionics company said to specialise in stealth technology, were on board. Wise noted that the plane was initially believed to have flown north. This was somewhat confirmed by the fact that the Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak initially requested for the search to take place in Kazakhstan. It was only later assumed that the plane had in fact flown south. When Wise and the Independent Group, an assortment of other aviation experts, re-examined the data, they determined that the plane had indeed flown north, whilst false data had been fed to the satellite. Checking the list of passengers, the group also noted that 2 Ukrainians and a Russian were on board. Not much was known about these 3 individuals, other than the fact that the Ukrainians came from Odessa, a former Soviet naval base, and that the Russian had a penchant for scuba diving. Wise postulates that the Russian came on board carrying scuba gear and 3 full-face diving masks, and that as the plane reached cruising altitude, this man slipped into the electronics and equipment bay once the crew were otherwise preoccupied. The EE bay, as it is called on a 777, can be accessed through the hatch at the front of first class. From here, the Russian would have had control over all of the plane's electronic systems. First he severed communications, then plugged in portable equipment which could upload false data to the satellite, and finally he depressurised the cabin whilst he and his accomplices breathed oxygen through their diving masks. The crew would have spotted that something was amiss by this point, but none of their checklists would have covered a possible hijacking from the EE bay. The anti-hijacking lock on the cockpit door could also be controlled from here, and it is thought that once the passengers and crew lapsed into unconsciousness, the 3 men took control of the plane and flew north, landing in Baikonur, Kazakhstan. The cabin was then repressurised before the passengers perished, and the 20 employees from Freescale Semiconductor were put to work for the Russians, spearheading their stealth program, whilst everyone else on board was, for want of a better word, silenced. But how realistic is this? A depressurized cabin would have likely killed all on board after only a few minutes, including the Freescale Semiconductor employees. But maybe a few minutes was all they needed to take control of the aircraft without any resistance. Another theory claims that the plane crash-landed in the remote jungles of Cambodia. In 2018, a British video producer, Ian Wilson, claimed to have spotted the aircraft's wreckage using Google Maps images dated to that year. The jungle where the aircraft crashed is not far from the flight's planned route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. This theory is not without doubts, however, as despite photographic evidence of what does appear to be a crashed aircraft in the Cambodian jungle, the plane in the image is roughly 10% larger than a Boeing 777, although true dimensions are difficult to ascertain with pinpoint precision. Other explanations attempt to explain the craft's disappearance, but like most, fail to answer every question. A former pilot, Christopher Goodfellow, speculates that an electrical fire was the most likely cause for disruption. He claims that the flight experienced a malfunction and turned back towards Malaysia looking for a place to land. According to Goodfellow, the aircraft would have flown on autopilot, as the fire incapacitated all on board. This seems to be a reasonable explanation. However, it still doesn't explain why the transponder was switched off, or why the route back across Malaysia was so calculated. The most popular outside theory concerning the flight's disappearance, though, centres around the pilot, Captain Saar. The story was not echoed by official sources. However, many invested in the story have reached the conclusion that he had planned the tragedy from the beginning, intending to commit suicide, wanting never to be found. In the time leading up to the flight, Saar had been practicing strange routes on his simulator, which he used in a separate room, isolated from others. It was discovered on his computer after the disappearance that he had practiced the exact route taken on that fateful day, but the final destination could not be determined. It was also made public that Saar was going through marital problems in the months before the flight, which seems significant when compounded with the specifics of the flight path. Firstly, as previously mentioned, Saar dipped his wing for a prolonged period over his hometown of Penang. Whilst this could easily be a coincidence, many have suggested that it was in fact a dramatic farewell to the captain's childhood home, before doing the unthinkable. The details of the flight's return can also be explained by Saar's involvement. The transponder was switched off from the cockpit during the handover between airspaces, which many assume to have been a calculated action to avoid detection. The route taken back across the Malaysian mainland was also a seemingly precise path meant to avoid showing up in either Thai or Malaysian airspace, a skilled manoeuvre only achievable for a pilot of Saar's experience. It is assumed that at this point, the crew would have realised that something was wrong. Experts have speculated that Saar would have been the one to depressurise the cabin and incapacitate those on board, including the crew, although it is unsure whether he was assisted by the co-pilot, Farik Abdul Hamid, or if Saar had to incapacitate him as well. Only at this point would he have been able to take the plane off course, flying out into the Indian Ocean, although it cannot be said exactly for how long. The best estimates of the flight path suggest that Saar could have flown for over 6 hours on the fuel reserves left after the initial manoeuvres. Experts have estimated that he could have coasted for another 100 nautical miles after the plane had run out of fuel, essentially using the aircraft as a large glider. This suggests that the plane did not go into a steep dive and crash into the ocean, which arguably would have resulted in far more fragments of wreckage being discovered. Instead, it is assumed that the plane descended relatively gently onto the surface of the sea, before taking on water and slowly sinking beneath the waves. This is the most popular of the theories surrounding the disappearance, but again it cannot be confirmed, and we must reiterate that this is not to condemn any one person, as nobody can say with any certainty what exactly occurred that day. There is still fierce debate over what became of MH370, with theorists pointing fingers at everybody from the Russians to aliens. Usually when discussing such topics, the correct answer is often the simplest. Yet with this case, none of the possible explanations seems to satisfy every last inexplicable detail, and so with MH370, the realm of possibility is still very much wide open. Whilst for investigators, this purgatory of perhaps never knowing is a frustration, it is important to bear in mind the families of those lost, who in this same state of limbo find little hope that their questions, and maybe even their prayers, will ever be answered. It is to these families, those of every single person aboard that flight, that our hearts and deepest sympathies go out to, and we sincerely hope that they one day have the answers they so desperately need.